Just giving a couple more seconds for people to roll in. And just a friendly reminder, everyone, as you come in, please try to I should mute my microphone. Please try to mute your microphones as you come in, folks. Okay, 6 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get started, and Catherine will handle letting people in the meantime. Anyways, hello, everyone. Thank you for coming back around to join us for today's webinar led by Dr. Susannah Lerman. Before I introduce today's illustrious speaker, a quick reminder that registration is open now for ELA's annual conference and Eco Marketplace. To sign up for the conference, please visit our website at ecolandscaping.org. Also, please be sure to fill out the evaluation for this webinar before signing off for the evening. Your responses help us to improve each webinar and all of our events. The webinar link will be made available through the Now, without further ado, here to talk about humanity for habitat, ELA is grateful and proud to introduce Dr. Susannah Lerman. Dr. Susannah Lerman is a research ecologist with the USDA Forest Service Northern Research Station. Her research assesses how wildlife respond to different management practices, focus on birds and bees, and how people interact with nature nearby. Her research emphasis is on private lands, which provide opportunities for the public to participate in science, conservation, and shared stewardship. Her research also assesses how to ensure equitable access to biodiversity. She mentors a diverse and exceptional group of young and early career scholars. Dr. Lerman, please take it away.
Well, thanks so much, and thanks everybody for joining the webinar today. I'm really excited to share my research. And so, as you just heard from my bio, I study the birds and the bees, but don't worry, it's not going to be that talk. No need to start squirming in your seats, but instead, I want to focus on these guys. So here on the screen, I'm showing a picture of a black-capped chickadee on the right and a sweat bee on, black-capped chickadee on the left, and then a sweat bee on the right. And when I think about when I explain the work that I do, and I explain that I study the birds and the bees, I tend to think about it and explain it within these ecosystem services framework. And this is not to say that I don't appreciate the birds and the bees just because of all of their wonderful aspects that they are for the benefits of biodiversity. But in order to really try to explain why they're so important, why wildlife is so important, and why we should care. And so, for example, if we take the chickadee on the left here, so Doug Tallamy painstakingly counted the number of insects that a pair of chickadees brought to their nest and estimated it to be between 7,000 and 9,000 insects to raise one clutch of chickadees. And so I don't know where everybody is tuning in from, but at least here in the Northeast where I'm at in Western Massachusetts, there's a lot of chickadees around. And so when we multiply the number of chickadees across the landscape, and in terms of the total number of insects that they are consuming to raise just one clutch of nestlings, we really get a sense of how many insects just chickadees are eating. And there's so many other insectivorous birds out there. And so they're really performing this incredible service in terms of keeping our insect populations in check. And then the bees. When we think about bees, they are just these incredible creatures in terms of being able to pollinate many of our flowering plants. And I like to think if we like to eat things like strawberries and a whole bunch of other different types of fruits and vegetables, we need to thank bees. And the USDA has estimated that they provide a $56 billion service per year pollinating our crops. And so I like to think both of these species, both birds and bees, are super important for our well-being. And then also they bring a lot of joy to our life. However, bees and the birds and a whole bunch of other wildlife species, they're in big trouble. And I really like this New Yorker cartoon because I think it really sums up a lot of the reasons why I do the work that I do. And the reason why our birds and bees are in big trouble is primarily because of habitat loss. And so, unfortunately, I'm pretty certain that for many people on the call today, this image here is pretty familiar, where you have these pristine wilderness areas or landscapes on the left, and here would be a typical scene in New England. And then it gets slated for development, the bulldozers come in, and they destroy a lot of the habitat, and we have this habitat loss. And I like to think of this as on the left as habitat and on the right as non-habitat. And this is how a lot of my colleagues would really classify these two different images. And I have a couple of different statistics here from recent studies that have really demonstrated how habitat loss has had a really detrimental impact on birds and bees in the United States. However, in addition to habitat loss, once the bulldozers leave the property, and and this is the largest reason for biodiversity crisis. But one of the things that happens that when the bulldozers leave the area, what we see in its place are these novel habitats. And so I like to think of it as habitat loss and alteration. And when I look at these yards, I think of all of this potential. All of this green space has the potential as wildlife habitat. And so I like to think of myself as a pretty optimistic person. I don't really like to focus so much on the doom and gloom. Yes, we do have this biodiversity crisis, but I really like to think about some of these solutions. And that's a lot of what the work that I do is really trying to figure out how we can try to reverse the decline of biodiversity, and especially within the focus of these residential landscapes. And so within these yards, in a recent paper that just came out in October in Bioscience, my colleagues and I estimated the total amount of land within the lower 48 in the United States that's classified as residential yards. And the number was pretty astonishing. So it's roughly 30% of US lands are in residential yard land use. And so I have a statistic here that it's roughly 7 times more land that's in yards than compared to protected lands like from national forests or grasslands or national parks. And the dark parts of the United States, so those are all the where all the yards are, and it really follows along with the population densities as well. But one of the things that I want to point out here is that yards are not just in these urban and suburban areas, that people are living across this urban to rural gradient. And we can see in these 3 different counties that I have presented here is the amount of urban and suburban and rural yards within these different types of counties. And the other thing to keep in mind as well, what we were able to estimate is that I have here listed the total number of yards that are considered urban and suburban and rural. And one of the things I want to have as a take-home message here is that the majority of all yards are in these suburban and urban areas. And that makes sense because that's where all the people are. In terms of the amount of land that's in residential yard development, that's happening in these rural areas. And so it's almost this kind of opposite flip. And so it's like 80% of all yard space within the United States is in these rural lands. And they might have more implications in terms of how we're managing our yards, especially when they're abutting some of these more wild and pristine areas. But basically, the main point of this slide is that yards are everywhere. And then the second component that gets me really excited about yards is that, my thing got stuck, is that there's so much variation in terms of the choices that we make when we're landscaping our yards. And so here I have just 3 different images of 3 different yards, and it really kind of shows all the different ways, the different types of plants, the different types of designs, the different types of colors, and everything that we can have to integrate into our landscapes. And because of this variation, this has really inspired my career over the last 20+ years to really get at whether or not wildlife responds to these different types of landscape designs and the different types of decisions that householders are making within their yards. And so as a scientist with the US Forest Service, a big component of the work that I do is really trying to provide the science to help inform the management. And so with that in mind, I'd like to share 3 different research projects, 3 of which that I'm a lead author on, and then another one of a colleagues of mine, to really demonstrate the science behind managing our yards for biodiversity. And so what I've done is I've color-coded the 4 different studies, so hopefully you'll be able to just follow along with the different colors. So we've got red first, then orange, then green, and then blue. But to start off, I have a little quiz for everybody here. So I would like you to let me know in the chat, and hopefully Aviva, you can let me know what people decide. I'm really curious whether or not you think Boston is on the left or on the right. So I'll take a second for everybody just to write in like left equals Boston or left equals Phoenix, just to get a sense of what people think about these two images.
Left is Phoenix. Oh, where are they going to do that?
All right, so we got left on Phoenix. Does anybody think that Phoenix is on the right?
It looks like, according to the chat, we've got, oh, I'm seeing just now one right is Phoenix. But for the most part, we are seeing left Phoenix, another left Boston. This is a hotly contended question, Susannah.
Okay, well, so this is what I was hoping, and I tried to choose images that had swimming pools in both of these cities, and so basically what we have is most of you were correct that Phoenix was on the left and Boston was on the right. I don't know if maybe because Phoenix is a gridded city and Boston is just chaos. But one of the things, I could have shown a whole bunch of different cities across the United States with this same type of view, this 10,000-foot view. And it's really hard to figure out what these cities are, where these cities are located. And we see this homogenization component in terms of the way our landscapes are formed. From a wildlife biologist perspective, the other thing that we're seeing is this homogenization of our bird communities. And so in all of these cities, in Boston and Phoenix and Los Angeles and Chicago and Houston and in Dallas and Baltimore and Washington, D.C., if we go into these cities and these neighborhoods, we're going to see pigeons and starlings and house sparrows. And we're going to see lots of these species. So we're seeing this homogenization of our bird communities as well as the way that our cities are formed. Okay, here's part 2 of the quiz. So I want everybody to, again, put in the chat whether they think Miami is on the left and Phoenix on the right, or Phoenix is on the left and Miami is on the right.
All right, I'm seeing, ooh, Jeannie says that Phoenix has clay-colored roofs. Let's see. Miami left, Phoenix right. Right is Phoenix. Phoenix on the right. Miami left, Miami left. Phoenix right, Miami left, Phoenix right. Left Miami.
Okay. So this is what I figured. And, you know, this is like really getting at this heterogeneity. And so there's all of this. So now it's getting a little bit confusing in terms of what city are we looking at. But this is actually a trick question, because both of these yards are Phoenix, Arizona. And so, yes, it's true that Phoenix has these orange roofs, but they also have a lot of grass throughout the city. And so because of this variation, this really kind of inspired my dissertation research about 20 years ago, where I was really curious to see whether or not birds noticed these two different types of landscape designs. And so working within the Central Arizona Phoenix Long-Term Ecological Research Project, which is tasked to study long-term ecological change throughout the city of Phoenix and the metro area, together with my colleague, Paige Warren, we looked at the bird community in 40 different neighborhoods scattered across Phoenix. And we went out and we counted birds using our binoculars and monitoring which species we would see, and then went back and identified the different types of different landscape designs. And so whether or not there's the grassy lawns that's on the left that looks more like Miami, and then the yards on the right that's more drought tolerant types of vegetation, these xeriscapes. And in addition to looking at all the different types of vegetation, we also co-located all of these sites within a US Census block group so we could get a sense of who might be experiencing these different types of species. And then finally, we also worked with our colleagues to administer a social survey to ask people their opinions about the birds in their neighborhood. And so this is a study that's really kind of linking the birds and people. And so one of the things that I'm hoping that's going to come through in my talk this evening is this theme about humanity and habitat, and how people and nature are intricately linked together. And a lot of my research is really linking those two together, recognizing that if we want to have wildlife habitat, especially in our backyards, in our urban, suburban, and rural areas, we need people on board. So I'm really interested in the people component in the ecology as well. Okay, so in terms of some of the data that we had, what we found is that when you have yards that look like the one on the left that look like Miami in Phoenix, lo and behold, you get these exotic and generalist species, your pigeons, your starlings, and your house sparrows. Basically, you add water, you get these different types of birds. These birds are not going to be as present in these more drought-tolerant landscapes because, as I mentioned, they need water. Whereas what we found is an increase in abundance in these desert landscapes with desert birds. So species like Gambel's quail, cactus wren, and greater roadrunner, these are birds, some of these most iconic species of the Southwest. These are the birds that make Phoenix really special. I'm never going to see a greater roadrunner up here in Massachusetts, or a cactus wren, no matter how many, how much I wish or try. So these are birds that we're only going to see in the Southwest. And so what this research was able to really demonstrate is that when you plant desert plants, you get desert birds. Now, this might not sound that surprising, but this was one of the first studies to actually test the idea that if we build it, will they come? And so again, this really provides the science behind that management implications and the management practices of planting these desert plants for native biodiversity. So the second component is really looking at who might be experiencing all these different species of birds. And so similar to the landscape designs, also found similar relationships that in these lower income, predominantly renters, predominantly Latin neighborhoods, an increase in abundance of our pigeons and starlings and house sparrows. Whereas in these higher income neighborhoods, primarily owner occupied and predominantly white neighborhoods, we saw an increase in abundance in these desert birds. Now, I just want to make a note that I am not vilifying pigeons, starlings, and house sparrows. I have a special place in my heart for those three species because I know for many people, these are the only birds that they have to interact with and that they find a lot of joy out of them. And that brings me a lot of joy. But I also find maybe just a slightly more joy when I go to Phoenix and I interact with cactus wrens and roadrunners and curve-billed thrashers and Gambel's quail. Again, some of these birds that I don't have a chance to see here in my backyard. And so what these results really highlight, though, is this unequal access to these desert birds. But then the question remains is, do people really notice? Does it really matter? And so the fourth part of this study is working with our social science colleagues, and they had administered a social survey to the same 40 neighborhoods where we collected all of our data in terms of what types of birds, who was living there, and what types of vegetation and landscape designs. And what we were able to do is to compare the desert bird richness that I have on the bottom on the x-axis, and one of the questions was, how satisfied are you with the birds in your neighborhood? And that's on the y-axis. And so we're really getting at the percentage that people are satisfied, that they're an indication of noticing the birds in their neighborhood. And what we found was a really strong relationship between desert bird richness and the level of satisfaction. So in other words, neighborhoods that had more Gambel's quail and cactus wren and these desert birds, people were more satisfied with the birds in their neighborhood. Now, I must note that the level of satisfaction was correlated with other types of satisfaction that people had in their neighborhoods. However, what our results demonstrate, one, is that people are noticing the birds in their neighborhood. And two, what it appears to be is that neighborhoods that are good for people are also good for desert birds and to try to help with biodiversity. And so this really is getting at this idea, like this level, looking at satisfaction is another way of measuring well-being. And so I know for me, when I see some of these species, it makes me really happy. And I think this is the case for a lot of other people as well. Okay. So the next study I want to talk about is really going at really addressing food webs. So the first study from Phoenix that I was just explaining is really getting at who is where, like where are the birds, how are they distributed across the landscape? And then now I really want to highlight Dr. Desiree Narengo's research, her dissertation, because it really gets at, well, how are they doing in these different landscapes? And so she designed a study to really address these food webs in terms of the food that the chickadees are eating and whether or not that has any implications for their nesting success. And this is a really important component because we want to make sure that we're not just inviting these birds in, we want to make sure that we're also providing places for them to raise their young. And so I'm going to simplify her 5 or 6 years of her dissertation into one slide, into 3 figures, but I think it tells a really great story. And so what she found was that in neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. that had more native plants had more caterpillars. And so if you remember, when I mentioned chickadees right at the beginning of the presentation, Doug Tallamy, who's also a co-author on this paper, was able to demonstrate the number of insects that a chickadee requires for raising young. And so here it's demonstrating that, okay, if you have more native plants, you're going to have more caterpillars, or in other words, more bird food. And the second component, what she was able to do by following chickadees around, is that chickadees spent more time in native plants, and probably because the chickadees are going to go where the food is. And then finally, her more recent publication from the PNAS demonstrated that these native plants, they're stabilizing the chickadee populations. And so what this, kind of to simplify this, I have a star here on this replacement graph. And basically, even though it says non-native plants on the x-axis, another way I like to think about it is that if you have your yard that has at least 70% of all the plant biomass is native, then you're going to have an opportunity for the chickadees to raise their youngs. They're going to increase that population. And so this really provides a really strong support for having these native plants, for supporting these native bird populations. And so this was a really exciting study, and again, really provides some of the science behind why we should be planting these native plants. Okay, so the next study I want to talk about is about lawns. And you might think, well, why are we talking about lawns? Because lawns cover the majority of most yards throughout the United States. And they are a dominant land cover throughout the United States. And one of the things that I remember during my dissertation defense about 13 years ago, I had just presented the work on Phoenix, and somebody had asked, well, what should we do? And my number one response was, let's get rid of all the lawns. Everybody cheered. I passed my exam, and I went on to start working on other research. But that idea of getting rid of all of our lawns, it kind of stuck with me for a little bit. And a couple months later, I came across this paper, this Malesi et al. In environmental management from 2005, that calculated the amount of lawn in the United States. And her and her co-authors estimated it to be about 163,800 square kilometers. So what does that mean? So I like to kind of put these numbers in spatial sense, because I have no idea how big that is or how small that is. And so that is the equivalent of the land area of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts. So it's a pretty significant amount of area that's as a lawn. And a lot of times, to make our lawns look this perfect, we are irrigating daily, we're mowing weekly, and we're seasonally applying some sort of fertilizer or pesticides or herbicides. And so there's a lot of different types of management practices that we are doing into our lawns to make them look very neat and uniform and devoid of any sort of structure. And I think because of all of these inputs and the intensity of the management, a lot of my colleagues are calling them biodiversity deserts, and that they're relatively useless for birds and bees. I put that in there as well. And again, I used to think that as well, going back to the day of my dissertation defense. But I kept coming back to this number of 163,800 square kilometers. and that it is nearly impossible for us to get rid of all of our lawns or even to significantly reduce all of our lawns. So instead of that, I came up with this new mantra that I think really kind of covers all of the research that I do, not just with lawns, but also with yards as well, is how do we make lawns less bad? And this is recognizing that we're never going to be able to have these more pristine wilderness areas in our backyards, but we have these opportunities to make them less bad. And as I just explained with the 2 other studies, by planting native plants, and here's another opportunity in terms of the actual management of our lawns. And so when I think about lawns, again, bringing in the people and the ecology component, I think about these social and ecological components of our lawns. And so when we think about our yards in general, they're often thought of as these extension of our home. And the primary motivation for how we're managing our landscapes is primarily driven by aesthetics. We want them to look nice. However, by mowing them so frequently, there is this consequence that we might actually be removing habitat. And I started thinking about this around the time, maybe this was about 2010, when everybody was talking about the plight of bees, and everybody was really nervous and concerned that we're losing bees and we're losing habitat. Even though a lot of the talk was about honeybees, there was also a lot of implications for our native bees as well. And so with that in mind, and with the idea that there's so much lawn out there, I came up with a study that really tests this hypothesis that if we mow our lawns less frequently, say every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks, then we would have more lawn flowers. And if we had more lawn flowers, then we would have more bees. So this would be another way that we could provide habitat for bees. And so I conducted this study in Springfield, Massachusetts. This is the 3rd largest city in the state of Massachusetts. And I focused primarily on what I call these lawn-dominated landscapes. And so most of the yards that we focused on 16 yards, and most of them looked like this. And so one of the things that I hope you notice is that these are not yards with pollinator gardens or a lot of different floral resources. They were pretty much lawns, maybe a tree or 2, a handful of foundational plants, and that's it. And so this enabled us to really get at this specific question about whether or not these lawn flowers could be providing habitat for bees. And so I was really kind of focused on these 2 main objectives. First is really getting at the habitat value of lawn-dominated yards. And so I'm a natural historian at heart. I'm really excited to go out and just see nature. And so I was just really curious whether or not there was nature in these different types of landscapes, which I think a lot of people would probably not really think that there's much going on. But then number 2, really getting at that, how do we make these lawns less bad, and really trying to figure out some alternative management decisions so that we can have our lawns and they can be for bee habitat as well. And so to conduct this study, as I mentioned, we did this in 16 different yards over the course of 2 years. And the yards were divided into different mowing regimes. So the yards got mowed every week, every 2 weeks, or every 3 weeks, based on this hypothesis that I have on the left-hand side here. And one of the things that's really challenging about having some sort of an experiment, to conduct an experiment anywhere in ecology, but especially in people's backyards, is really trying to control all of these other factors so that you can hone in on the specific question that you're interested in. And for this case, I was really interested in the lawn mowing frequency. And so we didn't want people that were assigned the 3-week mowing regime to go rogue on us and start mowing every week or every 2 weeks. So in order to tackle that issue, we provided free lawn mowing service over the course of 2 years. And so this was one opportunity for us to help recruit yards into the study, and then also to give back, because we were at people's yards pretty frequently, and especially for the yards that were mowed every 3 weeks, people weren't necessarily that excited about having that, that mowing regime. But anyways, one of the things that was kind of fun about the study is that we kept track of how much we mowed, and we mowed a lot. And it was the equivalent of pushing the mower from Springfield to Philadelphia and back. And I have a picture here in the top left corner of one of the yards that got mowed every week. And we clocked in about 75 miles for that individual yard. So when we think about some of these ecosystem services, if we are the one who's out pushing the lawnmower, if it's electric mower, even better. there is that opportunity for getting exercise when we're mowing. But let's get back to the bees and the different types of plants. So one of the first part of the hypothesis, again, if we mow our lawns less, then we'll have more lawn flowers. And what we found, first of all, from that natural history perspective, is a lot of different species growing spontaneously in these lawns. And so we identified at least 58 different species. And I have the top 10 most common ones listed on the left-hand side. And again, it was one of those issues where, you know, when you look out onto a lawn, you think there's only just grass growing. But then when you actually get down on your hands and knees and start looking, start realizing there's actually a lot of diversity going on in there. There's a lot of potential for different plant species to be growing in there, especially when we are not fertilizing or applying other types of chemicals. But in terms of the hypothesis, we did find that if you mow your lawn less frequently, lo and behold, you do have more lawn flowers. And so I have the 3 different mowing regimes frequencies on the x-axis and those different bar charts. And so basically this was not too surprising. It just seemed, again, very similar to the if you plant native plants, you are going to get these native birds. So kind of a similar situation that we had here. But nonetheless, again, I always feel it's important to have the science behind what we think is true in these landscapes. Okay, well, what about the bees in these areas? So again, in terms of the natural history, we identified 111 different species, and there was roughly 35 different species per yard. And so these numbers still astonish me. And this is still, even though the research was published in 2018 and 2016. We conducted the research back in 2012 and 13. And it's still, every time I see this slide and I think about 111 species, it's incredible. To put that into perspective, there's this, the number of species that we identified is roughly about 1/4 of all bee species that have been recorded in the state of Massachusetts. And so the fact that we have 1/4 of all bee species in these lawn-dominated yards and only 16 lawns that we looked at in these 16 different yards and only looking at one type of land use is pretty extraordinary. My colleague Joan Milam, she's more of the bee taxonomist on this project. She's still amazed by how many bees that we identified. The other bee that I want to talk about is the one here on the right, this Lasioglossum ilioense. I know it's very boring and drab, and it's not really as exciting as some of the bees I'm about to show you. However, one of the things that's kind of cool about this bee, a couple of things. First of all, this was our most abundant bee that we encountered during our study. And the reason why that is interesting is that the last time Lasioglossum ilioense was recorded in the state of Massachusetts was back in the 1920s. And so this was kind of interesting. And it was also, there was only 2 records of the species, and it was from the eastern part of the state. And so for a little while, we thought, well, maybe we have a unique species, and we did some genetic work. But it turned out it was just Lasioglossum ilioense. But I think what this really demonstrates, again, like the surprises that we found in the lawns in terms of the flowers, is that when you start looking in these unexpected places, you're going to be surprised, and you're going to be finding some of these exciting species that are lurking lurking underneath our feet. So that part was really exciting. And also all the people that took part in the study, they got pretty excited because they thought there was this rare bee that was visiting their lawns. It is very common further south. And so one thing that we might have been able to document is that this northward movement of this species moving up into Springfield. But I've talked a lot about all the different types of bees, but I just want to take a moment and just to let you have some eye candy. These are a handful of the different species that we encountered on our lawns. And if you have an hour or 2 or 3 to kill, what I suggest you do is Google Sam Droege USGS. These are all his photographs, and he has a ton of other photographs of bees, and he just really captures their cuteness and their beauty and their extraordinariness and their colors and their shapes and their furriness. And I think if you have a chance to look more at these bees, you too will fall in love with them as well. But let's get back to our hypothesis. So as a reminder, I was testing to see if we mow less frequently, do we have more flowers? The answer is yes, I have that up here. But what about the bees? Do we see more bees? And the short answer is yes, but it's a little bit complicated. And so what I've shown here is that the yards that were mowed every 2 weeks had the highest bee abundance, so the most bees that were present in those yards. And what we were able to demonstrate through all of our analyses is that the bee abundance was strongly related to the lawn flower abundance. So that, in other words, the bees are responding to the different types and the amounts of flowers that are present in these lawns. But one of the things we noticed is that there was a lot of these workhorse species. So there's a few species that tended to dominate the bee community in these yards that were mowed every 2 weeks. And so I must admit, I was a little surprised and also a little disappointed that the yards that were mowed every 3 weeks didn't have more bees. But one of the things that I started thinking about more is that the idea that in addition to these yards that are mowed every 3 weeks, not only do they have more flowers, they also have taller grass. Now, the majority of the bees, including the Lasioglossum ilioense that I showed you in the previous slides, are super, super small. They're about the size of a grain of rice. And so one hypothesis we have is that in addition to there being more flowers, the grass is also taller. And so therefore it might make it a little bit more difficult for some of these bees, these small bee species, to be accessing the pollen nectar in these lawn flowers. We don't know for certain, but that seems to be one way of explaining these different patterns. But nonetheless, it seems that the yards that are mowed every 2 weeks really provides this nice sweet spot. And this seems to be good for bees and also acceptable by the people that were part of the study and people in general. And so to wrap this up, I want to get back to this question: are these biological deserts? Now, I by no means want to be known as the wildlife biologist that's promoting lawns for bee habitat, because if it were up to me, I wish all of our lawns looked like the one on the right. However, I know that that takes a lot of time, it takes effort, it takes a green thumb, and for some people, it's just not attractive. And so in addition to planting pollinator gardens, what this research is really showing is that there are other ways that we can be providing bee habitat by doing less. And I call this the lazy lawnmower approach. And I like to think of it, it's economical, it's time-saving, it's simple, you don't need extra skills. Anybody can do it by doing less. And I know for me, somebody who spends a lot of time working, I don't have this extra time to go out and do gardening. But although this is the audience, the Landscape Alliance, hopefully this is something that you're already involved in landscaping, but for everybody else, here's another opportunity for us to be a part of this. Okay, so the first 3 studies that I've talked about really focused in on one particular space or one particular city, either Phoenix, Washington, DC, and Springfield. And they also really honed in on a specific type of landscape design, whether it's native or non-native, or desert and non-desert types of plants, or different types of lawn mowing. And so working with some of my colleagues on this American residential macro system, we've kind of exploded those studies to really expand beyond a single city, to look at 6 cities across the United States that I have shown here in Boston, Baltimore, Miami, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Phoenix, and Los Angeles, and then looking at a whole bunch of different responses, but I'm going to focus on bird responses. And one of the things that we were really interested in, again, to see how birds respond to different types of landscape designs. And we identified 4 different landscape designs, and I have them here on the bottom left corner. And so in the top left corner, we worked with the National Wildlife Federation with their wildlife certified yards. We also looked at yards that had some sort of water conservation. And so these would be yards that had rain gardens in the eastern cities and then xeriscaping in the western cities. And then 2 different types of lawn management, these lawn dominated yards. So those that were these high management lawns that had fertilizer application, and then these low management lawns, like these lazy lawnmower types of lawns. And our hypothesis here was really testing whether or not these wildlife certified yards work. And so again, going back to the science to inform management. And so we hypothesized that the bird communities would be in these wildlife certified yards would be more similar to the landscapes that were replaced by urban development, by suburban development. And so in addition to looking at the bird community in these yards, we also looked at parks, two different types of parks, parks that were on the outskirts of cities and then parks that were embedded within the cities. And so we really were trying to get at whether or not the bird communities differed between these different components. Now, when we just looked at things like species richness and the number of the different types of non-native species, we found that all of the yards seemed to cluster together. They all, in general, it didn't matter how they were designed, they all had, in general, the yards had higher species richness compared to the parks. They also had more of these non-native species like the pigeons and starlings and grackles and house sparrows. However, and not surprising, the parks had more species of conservation concern, insectivores, so birds that are eating insects, and a lot more native species. So this part wasn't too surprising, but it's just one indication that at one level, there's really these wildlife certified yards might not be performing at the same level as these parks. An additional component that we looked at was this, this concept of looking at turnover. And so here, what we were able to find is that the wildlife certified yards were behaving in terms of the way the turnover of the bird communities was more similar to the parks, so these unmanaged parks in these natural areas. And then in terms of what clustered together was all the three other types of yards. But what does turnover mean? I know this concept is a little tricky. It's taken me a couple of years to really wrap my head around this. And so another way of looking at this is here I'm going to focus in on the wildlife certified yards and high management lawn yards. And so this is how turnover works. So say we're in the city of Boston and we go to one yard that's wildlife certified, wildlife friendly. And the first yard that we go to, and in terms of, we look at the bird community and we identify a northern cardinal, an American robin, and a pileated woodpecker. Pretty cool. Those are great birds. We go to another yard that's wildlife certified. And then lo and behold, we see two new species. We see a wood thrush and a black-capped chickadee. Oh, that's cool. And then if we go to another yard, we see yet another new species. There's a gray catbird that joins the mix. And then we go to a fourth yard and we pick up yet another species, a yellow warbler. But the thing to keep in mind is that the turnover, the different types of birds, it keeps differing from yard to yard when they are wildlife certified. And so what this implies is that if we continue to have more wildlife certified yards, or at least wildlife friendly yards, yards that are managed for wildlife, we have this opportunity of providing additional niches for additional species and increased biodiversity. And this is one way that we can combat that homogenization of urban nature. So that's pretty cool. And so just to drive that point even further, what we found is that the yards that had these high management lawns, basically, if we go from yard to yard to yard, we're seeing the same species. There's not that same type of turnover. So these are the yards that are more homogenized. So it's just basically what I'm trying to get at is that there's a whole bunch of different ways that we can look at biodiversity. And it's not necessarily kind of picking and choosing which one makes sense and helps with our narrative, but there's a whole bunch of different ways that we can look at biodiversity and that it can be pretty complicated. But this is really demonstrating that by managing our yards for wildlife, there is this opportunity for increasing biodiversity. And so I like to think of it as, you know, there is this opportunity that you have the three different types of yards that are not like the water conservation and the lawn dominated yards are more on the left. And whereas at least when we think about turnover, the wildlife friendly yards are, the bird community is more similar to these parks. Okay, so the last component of this study that I want to share, again, is this is bringing the people component into it. So the Phoenix research really demonstrated that people do seem to notice. And so the other question we wanted to get at in terms of these different designs and bird communities is, well, how people might be interacting with the birds in their backyards and whether or not they like these birds. And so we adopted this public interest score, and this was a way to kind of give a score of how popular an individual species is. And this is based on a paper that came out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science in 2019 by Schutz and Johnson. And basically what they were able to do is they searched all the different species of bird species in the United States, and they gave it a score based on whether or not the bird was searched more versus being encountered. And so the way this is set up, for those who are unfamiliar with the program eBird, so this is a citizen science platform where birders can go out anywhere across the world now, but especially within these different neighborhoods, and they can record the different bird species that they see and upload them onto a platform that's called eBird. And so then we know what birds have been encountered. And so what they're able to do is to compare the number of times somebody might Google a species and the number of times that species might have been encountered to get at this this public interest score. And so if they were Googled more than they were encountered, then it gets a higher popularity score. So for example, some of the popular species are wild turkey, snowy owl, and golden eagle. So especially with snowy owl and golden eagle, these are birds that are very rarely encountered, but people really like them. And I wonder, with snowy owl, probably related to Harry Potter and some other types of shows and books that people get excited about. Whereas some of our least popular species are species like Couch's kingbird and Abert's towhee and Lucy's warbler. So for these species, most people don't even know that they're flicking around in our backyards and our washes in some of these wild places. And they're not as exciting as some of these other species. So using this process in mind, we were able to look at the popularity, the public interest of these different birds. And what we found was that the yards, regardless of how they're landscaped, tended to have more of these popular species compared to the parks. And so these would be birds like black-capped chickadee and American robin, birds that people are really familiar with. And so to kind of sum this up from the conservation perspective, there's these two ideas about this different types of strategies when we think about these designs. And so I have on the left this idea of land sharing, and this is where we're sharing our yards with birds and people. And so Amy Belair and her colleagues had a really great paper that came out in 2015 that really demonstrated that there is this great opportunity for us to share our yards with birds. And then there's this other component about land sparing. And what we know from our research and from other research out there is that when you conserve these large tracts of land, you are able to conserve some of these species of conservation concern. And so these two different concepts, this land sharing or land sparing, have really been in the conservation debate for a while. But what I like to think about is that it's not an or, but it's an and, that we can have both land sharing and land sparing, and that they both have these potential for increasing biodiversity, as well as getting people excited about the birds in their backyards. Okay, so I've mainly focused on the benefits of wildlife and biodiversity, and so I want to just briefly talk about some of these synergistic benefits of planting more trees and having more trees for having more habitat. And so the climate crisis is also very real. And so in a sense, we can, I hate to say it, but we can kill two birds with one stone by addressing the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis by planting more trees, because we're creating more habitat. And what we're also able to do is provide these other ecosystem functions and services in these yards. So for example, there's some research in North Carolina that showed the more canopy cover you had, the more ability the trees had to take in some of the rainfall. And that was an opportunity, if we think about that, of having drier basements. So that there's more trees, there's more opportunity, especially when we think about in terms of climate change, we're going to have more intensive storms, more frequent. And so if there's more trees, they're going to be able to take off some of that, that runoff. The other thing to keep in mind is that increased in canopy cover, these areas tend to be cooler as well. And so again, this is really showing that if we're managing our yards for wildlife, we're also going to be having these other benefits for us, the householder, as well. And then one other component, another synergistic benefit of more trees and more habitat is the amount of carbon that gets stored in these yards. And so there's some research in the UK that demonstrated that there's more carbon stored, and that's a good thing because we want to keep that carbon in the ground. More carbon is stored under in yards that have more trees than yards that have more herbaceous cover like lawns. And they saw a difference in residential yards, but not in parks and agricultural areas. So I've talked all about the science that I hope has really convinced you that, yes, we really can plant our yards for wildlife, but it might not be as easy as just going out and changing up our landscape. And there's several barriers, but I also want to focus in on some of the opportunities. So I'm going to talk about 3 barriers and then some of the opportunities that come across with that. The first is these social barriers. And so as I've been mentioning, especially with the lawn mowing study, is that it's incredibly important to make sure our yards are aesthetically pleasing. And it's important to adhere to these social norms. Like a lot of times we might be managing our yards, not necessarily how we want to manage them, but how we think our neighbors want us to manage them. And so Joan Nassauer from the University of Michigan, she came up with this concept of these cues to care. So for example, by putting in a sign might move the conversation from neglect to intention. There's also these opportunities to partner with other gardeners to increase their ability to have more wildlife-friendly gardening practices in addition to just the regular gardening components. And then also to empower these local champions. Like how do we have Jones, like keeping up with the Jones, how do we have the Joneses be the ones who are planting these wildlife habitats? There's these economic components, and that it could be cost prohibitive to having more trees or more types of wildlife-friendly plants. But there's a whole number of rebate programs and tax incentives out there. And what I find that's really fascinating is that a lot of these rebate programs are being led by utility companies. And so by electricity companies or water and soil resource company agencies. And so really trying to get everybody involved with trying to provide these opportunities to reduce these barriers. And the third barrier I want to talk about are these different types of policies. And so a lot of cities have these local weed laws that make it so that you, even if you wanted to plant a prairie landscape with taller plants, you are not allowed to because you have to keep all vegetation under 6, sometimes 8 inches tall. And also that a lot of times these yards are not part of the conversation for conservation. And so one of the things that I think is really promising is this opportunity to revise some of these local ordinances. And we're seeing that in this, the state of Wisconsin. There's 2 cities that have changed their local ordinances so that they could adapt to either the low mow May or no mow May to reduce lawn mowing in the month of May for bees. And then there's also an opportunity to work within the Executive Order 14008. And so this is by the Biden and Harris administration that came out a couple of years ago, and it's also known as the 30 by 30. And so what this is implying is to address the climate crisis, to protect 30% of the US lands and water by the year 2030. And in order to do that, yards really can be part of that conversation. Okay, I'm almost done. Thanks for hanging in there. So I just kind of want to bring it all back home. What does this all mean? And so I'm hoping what I've been able to share this evening is that there's so many different opportunities to engage with wildlife gardening. And there's so many benefits both for wildlife and for us. And so I'd like to think about, when we think about the way that we're managing our lawns, there's all these different ways for people to kind of tap in. There's not a one size fits all. But I also want to highlight that there are a few key things. If we just plant a few more native plants, and that, yes, if we do garden for wildlife, it does have an opportunity for providing habitat. If we mow and manage these lawns and yards less intensively, it can have really strong implications for biodiversity. And the last component is, I think that lawns in particular are really having this moment, and whether or not we're going to see this moment transforming into a movement. And finally, this whole idea, I haven't really talked too much about this idea of scaling up. I've mostly focused in on the individual yard, but these yards are part of a neighborhood, and these neighborhoods are part of a region or a city. And so it's really important that we start scaling up talking with our neighbors, talking across neighborhoods to try to have as much wildlife habitat as we can. And this idea of having our yards not necessarily just for aesthetics is not new. And so one of the things that I got really excited about this research is this whole concept of these victory gardens. And so my first degree is in American history, and I focused in on World War II. And one of the things that, as I started doing my work on wildlife gardening, is that it seemed to really fall in place with these victory gardens. And so, like these victory gardens back in the 1940s, were addressing the food shortages due to high enlistment of farmers. What I like to think of is that these yards, when we're using this humanity for habitat component of saving nature at home, is following along with what has already happened and has precedent from the 1940s. But rather than growing food for us, we're growing food for wildlife. And the other thing is that having these wildlife habitat yards is not new. So this is a publication from other Forest Service colleagues from 50 years ago that invites wildlife to your backyard. And this was really the inspiration for the National Wildlife Federation's certification program. But it also represented the shift of how we think about wildlife management. So rather than it's just something that happens outside of our backyards, it's front and center in our yards. And I think what I like to think of in terms of my contribution for our recent paper is that we're putting the humanity component really in that. Because when we think about this idea of humanity for habitat, especially when we're creating these wildlife habitats, when we're doing something, we have this opportunity to see something. And when we see something, we have an opportunity to feel something. And I've talked a lot about the birds and the bees and the flowers and the trees, but it really is all about a thing called love. And so with that, I'd be happy to take questions. I'll just put this here. This is my contact information, my email, my website. You can find all of my papers that I talked about are free, and you're able to download them there as well. And so with that, I think, should I stop sharing my screen?
You're welcome to. Yeah, go ahead and come back in and join us in the Google Meet.
Let's see.
All right, so we are scheduled until 7 p.m. So it looks like we do have